In this series, we're going to take your piece from this to this, all using skills, tips and tricks brought to you right here. There's no previous learning needed, no fancy plugins or synthesizers, and no musical understanding. The only things you'll need will be your eyes, your ears, a DAW, and a sample instrument. So come on, let's get started. Hi, Adam from Audio Imperia here, and welcome to the final episode in our series, The Journey to Becoming a Composer. In this series, we've covered the fundamentals of MIDI composition and looked at how we've applied those fundamentals to compose and orchestrate a track. In this final episode, we're going to be taking a brief look at project organization, mixing and mastering, as well as talking a little bit about future content. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, please feel free to give this video a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear about future content. Also, the MIDI for the musical example we've used throughout this series is available to download, and a link to it can be found in the description below. This track was created using just our all-in-one orchestral library Nucleus. So if you haven't already, be sure to download the MIDI, connect it up to your copy of Nucleus and explore it in your own time. Let's head over to the DAW and talk about project organization, mixing and mastering. So let's talk a little bit about organization. When I'm working on something that has quite a lot of tracks, like a film score or a trailer album or something like that, it really pays to try and keep things organized and keep things in a system that's easy to navigate quickly. So you're not spending loads of time wondering what each track is or where it is in your template. So you can see here that I've just organized everything by the major groups. We've got the strings, we've got the woodwinds, the brass, the atonal percussion, the choir, and then the pads here, which is just one track in this case. And I've also color coded each instrument group. That's something that I do, and obviously you can choose your own colors. These are just the colors I've used for years, so these are the ones I go to. It's also great working this way as well, because it means I can close stuff down that I'm not using, make it really small, and then I can open up the stuff that I am using so that I don't have constantly things going all the way down and I'm flicking back and forth. I can just manage these things really quickly, look through particular folder groups to find the instruments that I'm looking for, and then edit them. And it just makes my whole workflow a lot quicker. And when you're working to deadline or you're working on a project that has a time-sensitive component to it, that just helps so much. A similar thing is going on in terms of organization in my mixer. Obviously, all the color coding remains here. That's carried straight over. But what's happening here is you'll see all the groups are going not just to folders, but you'll see all the individual instruments are going not just to their own folder group, but also to their own bus here, their own audio group. So all the strings are going to the strings, woodwinds to woodwinds, brass to brass, etc. And then at the end of my chain here, I have those individual groups. And they are all going to a master fader, which is here. And that master fader is what I can then use to add my mastering chain and do the final tweaks to bring this to where I want it to be. So you can imagine everything as a kind of flowchart. The individual tracks are going to groups, the groups are going to a master, and on bigger projects or more complicated projects, you could have all kinds of different subgroups and groups that feed into each other. Sometimes these templates can get very complicated. For this, I just wanted to keep it simple. I was only using one library. Everything already sounds pretty great out of the box, so I didn't need to do too much in terms of that. So as you go through and become more familiar with these concepts and how they're used, the more you can develop your own templates that work best for your workflow and for what project you're working on at any given time. So let's move on now to a brief overview of mixing and mastering. Now you could spend hundreds and hundreds of hours on this topic, so this is going to be at best a very, very brief overview. But nevertheless, hopefully it's going to give you just some ideas, some things to think about and some tips when it comes to mixing your own music. Mixing is a really complicated topic. But if I had to try and give some kind of analogy for what you're doing, if you think about the audio landscape, the sonic landscape, you only have so much room in terms of frequency, so much room in terms of volume. If you think of it like a kind of box, you can only fill that box with so many different things. It took me a while to figure out that for me, mixing is really closely connected to arrangement. In other words, what instruments you put into a track and what the function of all those instruments are. You can't really make a good mix out of a bad arrangement, which is why it's so important to understand arrangement and orchestration and how you layer up different instruments, how they fit into the frequency spectrum, what kind of volumes they're at, what kind of space they take up in the track. And then the mixing mostly just takes care of itself, and all you're really doing is using the mixing to maybe just tame some elements or bring some elements out, as opposed to completely transforming the sound of everything, which is really not what you're supposed to be doing when you're mixing. So I would always think about mixing as being a part of the process that just helps to slot everything into place. A lot of mixing is really just volume control, simple volume control. As you'll see, I'm using the volume here, and in a lot of different instruments here, just very gentle movements just to help things blend into the mix. I would always start when you're mixing with just trying to balance things as much as possible with volume. Again, this goes back to the arranging idea. If you have a good arrangement, you should be able to get it 80%, 90% of the way to how you want it to sound, just through a combination of that arrangement and changing the volume of each instrument in the arrangement to roughly get it where it needs to in the mix. When I mixed this piece, apart from the reverb, I just used Cubase stock plugins or free plugins. I didn't really want to use any complicated or expensive plugins because I just kind of wanted to show you that it's not really about that. Those things may help a little bit. Sometimes they look nice. Sometimes they offer some features that are very useful. But actually, you really don't need expensive stuff. There's plenty of really great stock and free stuff, and for a beginner composer you can find all you'll ever need just in your door already or out there for free. So we'll look a little bit about the mix of this track, and I don't want to go through each individual instrument, that would just take us all day, so I just want to talk generally. You'll see first of all that the majority of my mixing is actually done here at the end in the group stages, rather than going in and surgically changing each individual instrument. I'm really doing most of the changes in the group stages, and then maybe just tweaking some stuff here and there in the individual instruments. So you'll see there's a few instruments here that have some EQ going on. For example, let's take a look at these trumpets. We have a little bit of gentle EQ here. Let's take a look at something else like our Grand Casa. Again, gentle stuff here. I'm really just carving stuff out most of the time. I'm rarely adding much. Now and again, I add a few dBs here and there. Let's take a little look at the horns. It's the same thing there. I'm just cutting a bit away. But in the individual tracks, I'm rarely doing more than that. All I'm doing here is adding a tiny bit of compression to the low brass. Apart from that, everything else is done in the group stages. So we're probably going to focus mostly on the group buses here. Now, each individual group bus has its own reverb here. There are different ways of adding reverb into your mixes. Sometimes you can do what are called sends, which are more complicated ways of adding reverb or effects, but give you more flexibility and control. I've just gone for the simple approach here and simply in my insert chain added a reverb plugin. Really old reverb plugin, but still great one called Quantum Leap Spaces, and I've just dialed in how much of the reverb I want for each individual section. It's as simple as that. I've not done any more. These has no extra controls apart from this pre-delay here. It's a very simple plugin, and I just wanted the reverb to basically just add a bit of space and a bit of width to the overall arrangement. That's all it's doing. Then for most of the groups, I'm using what's called a multi-band compressor. Now, compression can be a complicated topic, but broadly speaking, compression is a tool in mixing, and generally speaking, how it works is when the volume of a track gets to a certain threshold, the compressor will fire up and reduce the volume of that track a little bit to stop it getting too loud. Now, it is more complicated than that overall. There's all kinds of different features of compressors that we probably don't have time to go into for this episode, but you can think about it as a way to automatically control the volume of a track. Multi-band compression is another level of complexity, and essentially it's like multiple compressors all baked into one, and each individual compressor only works in a certain part of the frequency spectrum. So as you can see here, we have a compressor for the very low frequencies, we have a compressor for the mid frequencies, we have a compressor for the mid-high frequencies, and then the very highest frequencies. And I can essentially set each one of these independently and they will work on just that frequency range. So it enables you a lot more levels of control. For example, if I solo the brass and play it here and I take the multi-band compressor in and out, you'll see what it's doing. It's really subtle stuff, but it's just opening up the high end a little bit and taming some of the mid frequencies. I'm also on most of these tracks using a simple EQ here. It's a stock EQ by Cubase called Frequency. And I'm just taking out a little bit more of certain frequency ranges that are a bit problematic. I find the frequency ranges that you have to pay the most attention to are usually somewhere in the sort of 150 to 300 range, and then again somewhere in the 1.5 to 3.5 kilohertz range. I think there's a few different reasons for this. Number one, I think most instruments have frequency content in those ranges. So in other words, when you have a lot of instruments, most of them will be playing somewhere in those frequencies, and they can all overlap, and that's why they need careful management. arrangement to balance out. The other reason is I think that our hearing is attuned for these kinds of frequency ranges. Very low content in the sub-range we tend to feel more than hear, and very high frequency content is similar. We tend to perceive it as excitement, but we don't really hear it. Most of our hearing is actually contained in that low hundreds to mid thousands frequency range. So now that we've covered the three main plugins that I'm using on each instrument group, the reverb, the EQ, and the multiband compressor, we'll look at a couple of the others that I'm using on specific groups. I'm using something called a stereo enhancer here, which enables you to either widen or narrow the perceived sound of a particular instrument or instrument group. And I'm just using this on the woodwinds here to actually narrow them slightly. In a traditional orchestra, the woodwinds are right in front of you, and they tend not to be too wide. You have the strings very wide, and the brass are quite wide at the back, and so are the percussion. Woodwind tends to take up a little bit less room, so sometimes I like to just narrow them in a little, and that also makes space for the other elements of the mix. So that's a technique I sometimes use with woodwinds, is just narrow them slightly, make space for the brass, and make the strings and brass sound wider by comparison. The other instrument plugin that I'm using is a soft clipper. Now, the soft clipper plugin is a type of distortion, but not distortion in the way you might traditionally think, like a guitar amp, but heavily distorts a signal. This is more of a saturation type distortion, and it adds in harmonic information that's very pleasing and that makes things sound a lot more rich by comparison. I like to use this on some instrument groups, particularly on brass, because it just adds a slight warmth and analog quality to it. It's very subtle, but it does help make a contribution in the entire mix. So I think the best thing to do is just to bypass all these plugins, play the track, and then introduce the plugins one by one, and you can see what effect it's having on the instrument groups and the overall mix. As you can see, it's really not doing a lot, and if you're listening to this on maybe less than optimal headphones or speakers, you might not even really notice much. And again, that goes back to my original principle. When I'm mixing, I'm not trying to completely transform what I have in front of me, because if what I have in front of me doesn't sound very good, then that's nearly always going to say more about your arrangement than it is about the quality of the mix. So let's move on to talk a little bit about mastering. Now, mastering is the final stage of processing to get a track ready for release. Now, whether that's released on a film score or streaming or some other format. Mastering historically was just a technical process to get the track ready for whatever particular format it was going to end up on. But these days, it's a lot more of an art form. And in addition to just bringing things up to the volume that you want them for final output, it can also be an opportunity to make subtle but important changes, altering the dynamic range, for example, to either enhance the track or maybe compress it slightly if needs be. Sometimes offering some very, very gentle EQ just to make everything sound a little bit more pleasing or a little bit brighter or more powerful. Like mixing, mastering is a stage we could spend hundreds of hours talking about. It's a very, very complicated subject. There are some people that devote their entire lives just to this one particular part of the process. So this isn't going to be a comprehensive look at mastering, but I'm going to show you what I did just to get this where I wanted it to be. So here is my mastering chain, and you'll see there's quite a few things here, but actually most of these things are doing very, very little. They're just offering very tiny adjustments. The first thing I have here is a great free plugin called OTT. This is a special type of multiband compressor. It can add a lot of excitement and a lot of punch to your mixes, but it's one of those plugins that should be used really pretty sparingly. As you can see, I have the depth, in other words, how much the plugin's affecting the track here, right down at 6%. It's not a plugin that you need much of to make a difference, certainly not at the mastering stage. So I'm really just keeping it pretty gentle here, but I'll show you what it's doing. Pretty subtle, but it's just adding a tiny bit of air and it's just opening up the mix slightly. So if we move on to the next plugin I'm using here, it's another multi-band compressor. And again, it's doing the same thing as it was for the instrument groups. It's just helping to open these up a bit. It's just helping smooth the overall sonic quality of the piece so that nothing pokes out too much or is buried too much and everything has a pretty even quality. So if I just show you what this is doing in the context of the overall master. Adding a tiny bit of volume, but it's also just opening up the top end a little bit and helping to keep the mids and lows under control so it doesn't become too muddy or too indistinct. If we move on to the next track here, this is a simple EQ and it's doing very, very little. At the mastering stage, if you're doing any EQ, you want it to be really quite subtle, really quite gentle changes. You don't want to be completely transforming the track. Here, I'm just taking off the very, very low end, often at the very lowest end, almost below the range of our hearing. There's just a lot of mud and rumble there that you don't need that's taking up unnecessary volume. So sometimes I like to cut that back a little bit, not completely, but just cut it down by a bit and open it up a little bit. It might not be something that you can audibly hear, but in terms of the overall perceived volume, it's quite important. I'm also just taking tiny bits off in the ranges that we talked about earlier, this kind of 1.5 to 3K and this sort of 150 to 200 range. I'm just cutting little bits out there to create a bit more space and a bit more clarity in the overall mix. So again, I'll show you before and after, and it will be very subtle. It's all very gentle stuff, but it's just helping to add a little bit of control and clamp down on some of the areas that may get a bit hot and a bit scrambled and just help to control them a little bit. Next up, we have a compressor, and this is again doing a very subtle job. It's not really compressing things and squashing them down at all. This is really gentle stuff here. It's not much more than 1 to 1.5 dBs of compression. Again, at this stage, you don't want to be doing anything drastic. You're just trying to even everything out to make sure it still has dynamics, soft and loud, etc., but just to kind of control those so that it's not too quiet or too loud at any given point. And you'll see this is barely doing anything, but it is important stuff in the context of the overall smoothness of the track. You can barely hear it, but it's just controlling things. You can see it's barely changing things by a decibel, but overall it's just helping to keep things in check. Then I have another soft clipper here. As we said earlier on, the soft clipper is a type of distortion, but this is a very musical distortion. It's not an ugly kind of nasty distortion. It's a very, very nice saturation. And what this is actually doing is just helping with the overall perceived volume of the track. Again, this will be very subtle. I'll play you a with and without, but you won't hear much of a difference, but it is just adding a little bit there. And finally, we have the limiters. Now, I'm actually using two limiters. One is sort of bringing the track up to volume and just making sure that it doesn't peak. And the final brick wall limiter is merely making sure there's no tiny sudden peaks that just escape this limiter. So if I just play you before and after the limiter, you'll see it's just bringing things up to volume. So there we go, guys. I hope this has given you a bit of an overview as to the process I use when mixing and mastering. And also, I hope the takeaway from this is that whilst mixing and mastering is hugely important to all types of music, and it's a very important stage that most composers will need to understand, mixing and mastering is not about completely transforming what you've written. It's about just bringing out what's already there. If something's not sounding mostly the way you want it to, and you're finding it doesn't have enough life or enough energy, or there's something that seems missing, or it feels a bit hollow, nearly always that will be an arrangement issue. And I always urge, especially starting composers, to work purely on their arrangements first. It can be tempting to start adding a bunch of plugins and trying to make things sound louder or more exciting or give them more energy. But actually, with the quality of sample libraries and samples available today, things sound amazing out of the box straight away. And I urge you guys to really just work on arrangement first. And then once you have things sounding 80 or 90% of the way you want it to, then go into the mixing and just do gentle, simple, basic techniques just to help balance things out. And I urge you guys, as always, to download the MIDI for this track, to hook it up to your Nucleus, and to either look at what I've done and maybe copy some of that if you want to try and get as close as you can to the way that I've made this thing, or better still, just experiment, just try your own thing and just use your ears to try and work with these things until you find something that sounds pleasing and musical and powerful and energetic, but also balanced and controlled. The MIDI is available to download in the link below, so download it, hook it up to Nucleus, and just have a blast working with it. I hope this has given you a little overview to mixing if you've never really done this before or not worked too much on the mixing side of things, and given you a way to think about a couple of elements of mixing and mastering that might help you going forward. And that brings us to the end of our series, The Journey to Becoming a Composer. We hope you found this series useful, inspiring, and full of tips and tricks that will improve your compositions and help you on your journey. But this is just the start. Going forward, we're going to be creating a lot more new content dealing with all aspects of MIDI composition in a range of different genres. And we would love to hear from you what you'd like to see more of. What do you find useful? What do you enjoy watching? And what would you like to see from us? Your feedback would be really useful and much appreciated. So leave us a comment below and let us know what you'd like to see more of. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And on behalf of everyone at Audio Imperia, I wish you all the best in your own journey to becoming a composer.